So just to introduce myself to everyone, my name's Ishita. I'm a graduate student at the University of Calgary in clinical neurosciences. And I've been a part of this course for the past 5 or 6 times that it's been offered. So I really enjoy getting to kind of be a part of this community just because it's such an interesting range of topics that's covered in this class. So I will share my screen now. And you can let me know if you have any issues seeing it.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. So my talk is called The Technological Revolution in Medicine. So obviously this is a very general, very broad title because I usually like to change a few things every time I present it, since there are so many interesting things happening in the sphere right now. It's hard to decide what exactly I want to cover. But this time I will be going over two really interesting developments, but they're both unrelated, but I think they're really interesting to talk about. So during my lecture, I kind of want it to be more of a discussion, just because I think all of us benefit from just hearing other people's opinions on it. So I'll have like a bunch of slides with questions and things on them, so you can feel free to chime in. So we'll start with regenerative medicine. So this is probably a term you've heard in the past in this course, but I'll be going over some of the basics and going through a few specific studies that we can talk about. So in general, regenerative medicine is using stem cells to replace damaged tissue. So obviously there's lots of applications for this in the future. So regenerative medicine can be used to treat things like macular degeneration by creating retinal cells, or diabetes by creating insulin producing cells, or Parkinson's by creating dopamine producing cells. So obviously the applications to this are pretty broad. So here are just a few examples of things that are currently being tested that have already started using regenerative medicine. So things like stem cell transplant in leukemia, and of course, Dolly the sheep. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of her, but she was a pretty big deal. She was born in 1996 and died in 2003. And she was the first cloned animal, cloned mammal. So it was pretty groundbreaking in 1996 when she was born. So I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about how Dolly the sheep was born, just to provide a kind of background on how embryonic stem cells are used. So Dolly the sheep had 3 mothers, essentially. So this one right here donated her nuclear matter. So this is the sheep that was actually genetically cloned. This sheep here donated mammary cells. And then finally, this final sheep here was actually, the blastocyst was implanted in her, and that's the sheep that carried Dolly to term and gave birth to her. So in 1996, when this first happened, obviously it was a big deal and it caused a lot of stir. People were worried that because we were now cloning sheep, that human cloning was going to be the next step. So obviously we know now, 25 years later, that it's not an immediate concern, human cloning. But something you might not know is that animal cloning is very popular and very common these days. So in 2008, the US legalized cow, goat, and pig cloning for agricultural purposes. And really interestingly, I was looking this up the other day, and you can actually clone your pets too, for the low price of $60,000 for a dog. And for some reason, cats are cheaper. They're $25,000 for cats. And it's really interesting because these companies, there's, I think it's called Viagen Pets in Canada, if you want to look into it. And there's companies like this all over the world who report that they've already cloned several hundreds of pets. And people who don't have that kind of money right now are cryopreserving their pets so that maybe in the future they can clone their pets. So it's really interesting that this kind of progress has happened within our lifetime. Like I was born in 1996 when this first thing happened, and now these things are really popular and used for agricultural purposes all the time. So I just wanted to point that out because I think I'll keep coming back to this idea of exponential change that we like to talk about in this course so much, because it really is exponential. So the issues with embryonic stem cells are that when we're talking about mammals and humans even, there's limited accessibility and there's possibility of immune rejection. So like I said, Dolly had basically genetic material and had the help of 3 different mothers. So there is a high possibility for rejection, for example, when this blastocyst was implanted in the surrogate mother. And it is also ethically complicated, especially when we start talking about embryonic stem cells in relation to humans. So it is a procedure that is done, but it is still heavily debated. So obviously some of the controversies that exist are, is human cloning the next step? And the fact that obtaining eggs from humans requires ovarian stimulation and heavy hormone doses for hyperovulation. And there's very limited studies on the long-term impacts that this can have. And some other questions that come up, why is selling most body parts illegal, but not eggs? And should clone embryos, if we're talking about humans or even other animals, have the same moral status as normal embryos? So this is kind of a question I wanted to pose to you guys. Do you have any thoughts or questions about this yet? Oh, is that a hand? You can unmute and say.
Yes, so I was going to respond to the clone embryos, why it should, well, I don't see why it shouldn't have the same moral status as normal embryo, because biologically it has the same component and structures as the biological embryo, a biological, like, quote unquote. So I don't think it should have like a different moral status.
So what about when we're talking about, if not necessarily an embryo, but what about we're talking about specific organ systems, which is a common target for regenerative medicine. So, okay, even if we're talking about embryos, what about if we create, let's say, human or animal embryos for scientific research? You want to test something on, you want to see how an embryo would react to a certain drug or a certain chemical to see what kind of effects that it has. Is that embryo, even though it's created for the purpose of science, does that still, is it still unethical to use that for research?
I can try to jump in here. Like, I think it depends on, because everybody has like a sort of different idea of what they include in their circle of life. And I know, like in certain religions, especially Christianity, like they will consider the embryo, regardless of how it's made, to be human life, right? Therefore, anything we do to it would be tampering with human life, therefore unethical, right? So I guess it just depends on where we individually draw our line. And it's difficult when we start telling other people where to draw the line. Like, that's the part I haven't figured out yet, but you know.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your thoughts. That's the issue, because embryonic stem cells are being used in research today, including human embryonic stem cells. But like you said, lots of different people have different boundaries or moral lines that they feel they don't want to cross and that other people shouldn't cross either. So the question is that who makes these kinds of rules or legislations, because these kind of issues aren't confined by, certain political lines or country lines, right? These are issues that kind of are applicable globally. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about. I don't think there's any real answers or answers we can come to right now, but yeah, does anyone else have any thoughts about this before I move on?
Yeah, I wanted to say that this topic kind of reminds me of this news article I saw about a year ago where there's like a scientist in China that did this CRISPR experiment on babies or on embryos. And I remember like at the time, my first reaction to the article headline was like, oh, that seems like so crazy. But then like if it turned out to actually be successful and could be helpful in curing future disease conditions, then maybe like the shock factor that I initially had, I don't know, it feels like it's modulated by the potential effects or results of the experiment. So yeah, that was just something that I was thinking about.
I actually, I'm going to talk about that specific experiment later on. So it is really interesting. There's lots of things to consider, because you're right. It's both shocking that this kind of thing is happening right now, but then when you think about the intent of it, you start to think that maybe it's not as bad, or maybe it is somewhat defensible. Okay, I'll move on, but if you have any thoughts, you can just feel free to jump in. So again, talking about exponential change, I just wanted to show you some of the reactions to IVF babies in the early 70s. So this was very, people were not happy with the development and application of in vitro fertilization. So people were against it. They thought that, if parents can't conceive the natural way, whatever that means, maybe they just shouldn't have babies, or maybe they should adopt. And this was in the 70s when this kind of technology was first coming out. So this baby here is the first IVF baby ever born. I think it was 78, 75, something like that. And now more than 4 million babies are born from IVF per year in the US. So it's really interesting how quickly the public perception of things changes, and how now if you say that you think IVF babies are like, bad or not normal, your perception is socially incorrect. Like, you are considered, you're wrong. There's no black or white or gray. IVF babies are just the same as non-IVF babies. There's like really no difference. So this is something else I wanted to bring up, because when we talk about the experiment where the babies were, their genetic makeup was changed using CRISPR, it's interesting to think about how these similar advancements have happened 25, 35, 50 years ago, and now, we don't think twice about it. So before we go on to talk about that experiment, I just wanted to talk about another alternative to embryonic stem cells. So you guys may have heard of this too, induced pluripotent stem cells. So this technique was first published in 2006 by Takahashi and Yamanaka, and they won a Nobel Prize for it, since it's pretty groundbreaking stuff, even if you think about it today. So essentially, they inserted 24 candidate genes into mouse tissue cells, and they isolated the clones of the cells that most resembled embryonic stem cells. So they isolated this several times over several steps, and they identified 4 specific genes that are responsible for turning these adult differentiated cells back into their pluripotent state. So as similar to embryonic stem cells as they can get. So I think this is really an amazing discovery that you can take adult cells and then turn them back into that immature state. So this is just a quote from their article. The epigenetic profile of a fully differentiated cell can be reprogrammed to a pluripotent state. So one of the most interesting things about this is it kind of eliminates the ethical issues that come with bodily autonomy when it comes to embryonic stem cells. So induced pluripotent stem cells can be derived from tissue like skin cells, blood cells, urine cells. So it doesn't have to be very invasive at all. And they're also suitable for autotransplantation with low risk of rejection because they're taken from you and then they're cultured and then put back into you. And they're also really great for disease modeling in vitro. So you can culture a section of a patient's cells in a petri dish, and then you can apply different therapies, different drugs to that, and be able to see how that person would respond to it without the patient actually having to go through trial and error where they try something for a few months and then see how it feels and then come back and deal with all the side effects. Some disadvantages are that the time between extraction and transplantation is quite long. So there's always a risk of transferring a mutation to a patient. So it's not 100% zero risk. And also, while these iPSCs are chosen to be as similar as they can to embryonic stem cells, they aren't identical. When it comes to genetics and cell culturing, there are always factors that we aren't 100% sure of, that we don't know how they would affect things down the line. So to kind of give you some background on the CRISPR study that we're going to talk about next, I just wanted to introduce what CRISPR-Cas9 is in case you don't know. So the two scientists responsible for creating this technique were awarded Nobel Prizes just last year. So essentially, the CRISPR-Cas9 system is a gene editing system where the Cas9 enzyme can go in and break the double strand of the DNA. CRISPR can make transcription factors that target specific genes, and genomic data can be rewritten and inserted. So this can be used to activate certain genes, silence certain genes, or in any way target them. You can take out and insert a new gene that you've created, and it also can include epigenetic triggers. So a certain gene can be activated by a certain environmental factor. So here's the study that we've been talking about out of China, and this was in 2018, so just a couple years ago. So to give you a background on what the study actually was, this was done with two couples in which the man had HIV and the woman did not. And the purpose of this experiment, this series of experiments, was to create a way for the babies of these couples to be born HIV-free and to be resistant to HIV for the rest of their lives. So to create this intrinsic genetic resistance to HIV. So just some more background on it. All the male participants, their HIV was well controlled by current treatments. And interestingly, Dr. He gave official notice of his work on November 8th, 2018, after the two babies had already been born. This is just some, background ethical information. A lot of the ethical consent forms in this study were misleading. It was called an AIDS vaccine development program, and some ethical review papers were also forged. So I want to show you the actual video of the researcher so we can actually talk about it before you make any decisions. Just a second. All right, so let me know if you can't hear this.
Two beautiful little Chinese girls named Lu and Lana came crying into the world as healthy as any other babies a few weeks ago. The girls are home now with their mom Grace and their dad Mark. Grace started her pregnancy by regular IVF with one difference. Right after we sent her husband's sperm into her egg, we're also sending a little bit of protein and instruction for gene surgery. When Lulu and Lana was just a single cell, this surgery removed the doorway through which HIV entered to infect people. A few days later, before returning Lulu and Lana to Grace's womb, we checked how the gene surgery went by whole genome sequencing. The result indicated that the surgery worked safely as intended. Grace's pregnancy was normal, which we monitored closely by ultrasound and blood tests. After birth, we again deep sequencing Lulu and Lana's whole genome. This verified the gene surgery worked safely. No gene was changed except the one to prevent HIV infection. The girls are safe, healthy as any other babies. When Mark saw her daughter for the first time, he said that he never thought he could be a father. No, he's found a reason to live, a reason to work, a purpose. You see, Mark is HIV. Discrimination in many developed countries may reverse worse. Employer fire people, doctor deny medical, and even falsely sterilize women. Mark and Grace could prepare to bring a child that would fail. Mark's words told me something I didn't fully appreciate. A gene surgery that could save a child from a lethal genetic disease like cystic fibrosis or from an arthritic infection from HIV doesn't just give that little boy or girl an equal chance at a healthy life. You hear of a family. As a father of two girls, I can't think of a gift more beautiful and wholesome for the society than giving another couple a chance to start a loving family.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there. I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. I know it's ethically complicated. It's kind of a gray area, but I wanted to know what kind of, what's your reaction to this?
I mean, I'm just remembering from when I first heard about this story, I think I was in like a sort of related class, and I remember the prof talking about it and everybody talking about like all the news articles that were coming out. And I do remember that the researcher had disappeared for a little bit after publishing the paper, which, I mean, it just, I think it adds more complexity because it's so ethically dubious. And I'm not sure how the children are doing now, but like, there's certainly a risk to be weighed there that, you know, in addition to the benefit of, you know, creating these HIV resistant children, I guess, that won't have to worry about that, to also introduce some other risk through the like CRISPR gene editing technique, right? Because it's not perfect. It's pretty darn good, but it's not perfect.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. There's lots of people have lots of different thoughts on this, but I think most people can agree that it's difficult to kind of predict exactly what effects that he had. Does anyone else want to contribute?
I'm curious about how the mother or the person that was carrying the children were monitored and like what that process was, because it sounds like if the pregnancy was closely monitored, then there was a lot of like medicalization of the body of the mom, and how that impacts also like the kids that are born through this experiment and how they were medicalized. And it's also like quite tricky because they technically didn't really have a chance to really consent to this process, but are living through it, assuming that they're well and thriving. And that's a tricky part because like they didn't have a choice to consent, but now it's kind of irreversible, and now they have this identity factor, like a medicalized identity factor, that puts them as like a almost in a way that objectifies them, and like is unable to really centralize that they are indeed like beings at the end of the day. But yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think you brought up a really interesting point about consent, because obviously if you're doing gene editing on embryos, like, you know, they can't consent. But how about when you know, the first IVF babies were being born? You know, they were also pretty objectified, as you say. Like the first baby whose picture I showed, her name was Louise or something. She was also seen as this, like, you know, scientific research object that people studied, and they kept seeing if there was like anything different about her compared to a baby born not by IVF. And similarly, if you think about even things like vaccines and stuff, like the immunizations that we all get, you know, the second we're born, we can't necessarily consent to those. And there's always, not always, but there are studies that show that these vaccines do have other impacts, you know, in our, just in our biology. So yeah, I don't know if there's any real you know, black or white answers to this, but yeah, thanks for bringing up those points. Did you have anything else to say as well?
I was just gonna say in regards to vaccines. So I was part of Korea when we had new vaccines come in. I was part of like the batch of babies that had vaccinations, and I still have like the scars from it. And it's interesting too because I don't really remember my childhood, but I like living in the social and like political context of Korea and like growing up there, had a lot of like, I definitely was quite involved with the medical community just because I had universal blood type and we're always at risk of war and stuff like that. So it's like having lived through, obviously this is not in the same context, but having lived through a similar experience where my body was quite medicalized, like it definitely had an impact on my understanding of like self-identity and like self-actualization. And coming from a mental health background, it just seems like it's unfortunate that at this time, this is something, it's like part of the process. Like usually the first couple kids who basically don't really have any agency or autonomy in society are objectified in this way and have to kind of like learn to unlearn the things that they were told, or like learn to actualize from an internal perspective instead of an external perspective. And I wonder how that will be mitigated with the development of technology and discussions around ethics and consent and like the fact that it's like human beings after all.
That is really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I don't think a lot of people can kind of understand what it would feel like to have, to have to be so involved in these kind of things. So I think that is a really interesting point of view that I probably hadn't thought of either, because it's different when you just think about these, nameless other babies going through these kind of things versus when you actually have some kind of connection to it. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Okay, I'll go to my next slide. It just has some more information in case you're curious about what actually happened with this project. So the actual study notes were released a bit early last year, I believe. So it's interesting because what the notes revealed is that genes close to the target genes were modified, which is obviously concerning because we don't know the effects that even tiny changes can have. We also see from the notes that the embryos displayed mosaicism, which means that some cells had the mutation and some didn't, which if this was true would defeat the whole purpose of it, because that would mean that they were still susceptible to infection, HIV infection. They also reported one off-target mutation by testing sample cells from the embryos. And they tested a sample of the cells, so we can assume that there were more than one off-target mutations, which is where it starts getting really sketchy. It starts getting a little concerning onto what the effects are actually going to be. And yeah, the Dr. He was not seen for a while after this all came out. But last year we found out that he was charged for 3 years in prison and charged almost $500,000. He pled guilty, but he continues to defend his research. So just some interesting things that I've seen online about this is that although a lot of scientists and people who have backgrounds in kind of how these studies are supposed to be run, people are like, no, this is obviously incorrect, this is wrong, because there are always certain checks and balances you have to go through before you can do this kind of thing. Whereas a lot of people, the public opinion, people ask, is this just the next step of, human evolution? Or is it the next step of how we eradicate life-threatening diseases that we don't have any cures for yet? Like maybe genetic modification is the way. Oh, sorry, I just noticed there's something in the chat. Okay, I'm gonna read this, but I'm gonna just ask one more question. So the big question here is the intent versus the impact, right? So obviously we know that the intent was good. It was a noble intent. He didn't want these babies to get HIV or have to deal with the social and medical consequences of having HIV. But the question is how we see it as a society dictated by that, or is it dictated by the impact it has? So if we find out that these kids grow up completely fine, completely healthy, and also resistant to HIV, exactly how we wanted, do we, instead of vilifying him, does he get a Nobel Prize for that? Or if the babies grow up and actually have some side effects, they have some medical issues due to this, can they sue him for that? So these are just some questions. I know I'm just throwing a bunch of random questions at you. So if you have thoughts on any of them, feel free to unmute yourself or contribute to the chat as well. Okay, I was just reading the comments. Thank you for that. Yeah, I agree with the comment that when everything is happening so fast, when this is a novel, groundbreaking thing, it is difficult to come up with the kind of legislation or regulations that need to be in place. So maybe it is something that we kind of need to take a step back, kind of understand what it means, and then go through these kind of discussions. Yeah, this is also something that comes up a lot, is that the fact that someone's going to do it, like the fact that a lot of significant scientific leaps have happened because someone was just like, I don't want to deal with the rules, I'm just going to try this. And then if it works, then great. If it doesn't, then I guess they have to take responsibility for it. So it is possible that studies like this are kind of the precedent for how we eradicate life-threatening diseases. So I'll move on to the next study, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity again if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think balancing both the intent and impact is really important. And I do feel like if anything happens to the children in the future, that he should be held responsible for it because he did initiate things. I think like knowing that the intent was a positive one kind of like helps his case for moving forward with it. But I think it does set like a dangerous precedent, the fact that like he went through all of this without informing the rest of the scientific community and getting proper permission beforehand. And I think like making sure that those ethical approvals are in place are important for this type of research in particular.
Yeah, I agree with that. And similarly, what Nadia said in the chat as well, that these kind of things should happen, like these kind of checks and like ethical questions should come up before rather than after, you know, having after like actually gene editing embryos. Also, just to let you know, these he implanted embryos in 2 couples, so 2 mothers. The second mother also had a kid, but everyone in this study is anonymous, so we don't have any information on them until the people who ran the study actually release more information. So it'll be interesting to follow this case and see if we actually do get more updates on the kids and the mother, which itself is confusing because we don't want, you know, the whole family and the 2 babies to just be, you know, lab rats where they're just always being tested on. But at the same time, it's really important because this happened to actually get some data on what actually occurred when these genes were edited. So I'll move on to the next study I'm going to talk about. This one is related, but it's not in humans, so maybe it's a little easier to come to decisions on. This is using gene-edited macaques, which are commonly used in neuroscience labs. So this group of monkeys was genetically edited to display a specific type of disease phenotype. So in this case, they were specifically looking for schizophrenic behavior. And they chose the one macaque that exhibited the most severe phenotypes and cloned it. So the one monkey that was showing the greatest signs of depression, anxiousness, and schizophrenic behavior. So to do this, they knocked out the BMAL1 gene, which is partially responsible for the regulation of the circadian rhythm, or the sleep-wake cycle. So the ethics of this are also complicated. I've linked a video here that you can see later when you have access to my slides. It's difficult to watch because essentially it's a group of baby monkeys that are obviously very distressed since they were specifically chosen to show the most schizophrenic behavior. So an advantage of this is that researchers can create custom model organisms that are closer to humans using primates instead of the usual mice and rats that are used in neuroscience labs. And could also reduce the number of monkeys used in labs because you don't have to go through the multiple generations of breeding. You can just pick a specific monkey that behaves the way you want it to, and then just clone that one. But at the same time, people who are against this are saying that monkeys are seen as tools. So the strongest disease phenotypes are specifically chosen. So the monkeys that are the most medically distressed are specifically chosen, and more of them are created to be used for tests. So do you guys feel similarly about this when we're talking about non-human primates, or is it the same?
Were the monkeys like killed at the end of this like research, or like how were they respected?
Okay, so generally in neuroscience studies, most of the animals, after whatever testing has been done to them, like to see how they react to a drug or to see how a certain injury, what effects a certain injury has, they're usually killed after. So you can study the actual brain. Does that change your view on it?
I think that the ethical questions that should be asked here is whether the monkeys were treated well in the lab. Like in my lab, I worked with mice, and we keep reiterating that we have to treat the mice with respect. That is, even though that we are induce a disease in them and use them to study, we have a duty to make their life the most meaningless to the point that they were sacrificed for the research. That is, we have to provide the best living environment, the food quality, and whenever we handle the mice, we should not be aggressive. So I think if we want to like judge this case, I would be interested in looking like whether there was like 10 monkeys in one cage, or whether there was one and there's a lot of stimulation inside the cage for them to like be stimulated, and if their living environment can be I guess created in a way that resemble their natural living environment as close as possible. So I think we shouldn't abolish the idea of using animals as research objects, but we should think about how we respect them and how we treat them in the process of using them as a research object.
If I could sort of jump in quickly, I think this goes back to what I said earlier about like where you draw your line, right? Like in the circle of what you like consider life or like closest to you. And for me, looking at this is really hard because I guess I put monkeys within what I consider quite similar to humans, and like, you know, it's like each of us has our own line, right? I'm sure vegans' lines are much further out than mine. Like, for example, like with rats, like I guess because I just consider them like a pest more than anything. Like I'm still a bit affected, but not as affected by considering the prospect of them being research objects. But at the same time, I can recognize that I'm not the one doing the research. So is it for me to tell the researcher where to draw the line, right? And I also recognize that like it is really important research. So like there is a purpose to it. And I mean, I can draw my personal line, but I don't know if I could draw the line for other people.
Yeah. Before I share my thoughts, does anyone else have anything to add?
I do. I'm curious as to like whenever I hear about research being done, whether it be on humans or non-animals or non-human animals or like plants even, I always think about how like who, or ask the question of like who is benefiting from this, and like in what ways are we making it so that the species that we are utilizing to benefit from, like how are we benefiting them in return? So I think that's like something that a lot of times people kind of forget to engage with, even if it is being asked and even if that is being considered in labs and stuff. But yeah, like the power relation and like the increase of power through the research outcomes, I think are often like overlooked and unengaged with when it comes in comparison to the impact that it is making in the development of the progress in scientific research.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's at the end of the day, like maybe some of us don't like animal research. Like for a personal example, I when deciding what to do for a graduate project, like I said, lots of neuroscience projects are done using animal models. And a lot of these are done using rats or mice. So some work that's really interesting and really beneficial for actual clinical applications comes from rats who are basically, they have induced brain damage by dropping a weight on their skull, because that creates the kind of lesions that humans get when you get in a car crash and things like that. But at the same time, even though I'm not personally willing to do that, because I don't know, just morally, I would not feel right doing that. I still have to understand that other people have to do this because it genuinely is benefiting people who have this kind of brain damage. So yeah, people have different lines, but it's not really a personal choice where to put that line for general society. And I just wanted to read these comments really quick as well. So governments are also ill-equipped for the rapid change in technology. Laws can take years to make, and technologies often don't need to wait if there aren't any laws stopping their use. So yeah, this is true because a lot of legislation, a lot of regulations are barely catching up. They're, most of them, when it comes to these healthcare innovations, a lot of them aren't even close to being there. It takes years and years for these kinds of regulations to go through. And yeah, we're in this permanent crisis of ethical progress because of how fast the world is changing. And I think what needs to happen is some kind of adaptation to actually get these kind of regulations being innovated as quickly as the actual scientific innovations. Okay, so these last questions are really interesting, and I don't know if I have an answer to them. Does cloning an animal remove its autonomy, making them an even better tool? An extension, if we still want to conduct animal experiments, to what extent is the ethical treatment of animals related to their likeness to human beings? Is there, yeah, okay. So this is why I brought up the primate example, because for some reason people have a harder time with research on monkeys instead of research on rats. obviously because they're more human-like. Does anyone want to kind of address that, or if you're all kind of tired of talking, I can move on. Okay, I'll keep going. As always, feel free to comment or unmute if you have something to say. Okay, so I wanted to talk about this conceptual shift of medicine when we're talking about these kind of gene editing studies. So obviously the traditional way we view, a physician is that they take a patient who has some kind of issue and they treat the patient with the goal of them no longer being a patient. Whereas now we're kind of going into a patient that's not, necessarily suffering, and then enhancing them, and we don't really know what's going to happen to that patient next. So this is kind of what we talk about when we're talking about transhumanism, or moving past the usual flow of human evolution and kind of inserting these kind of genetic factors, because if we gene edit embryos, they are going to be added to the gene pool. These are changes that will be heritable, that will be in the gene pool, right? So is this kind of the next step of how medicine and society will kind of move forward to get past these life-threatening diseases that we are struggling with today? So we've talked about all of this, so it's really good. We covered most of this about the moral issues, the ethical issues that are kind of happening. So I'll move past this. Okay, so the next section I wanted to talk about, which is very different from gene editing, but I also think is very interesting and comes with a lot of ethical questions of its own. It's intelligence and consciousness. Okay, so a lot of the time when when computer scientists, when scientists in general, we're talking about artificial intelligence, we just kind of assume that when something's intelligent enough, it'll just gain consciousness. And we don't really know how, and we don't really talk about this process if it's really a necessary thing. Like, just because something is intelligent, does it really mean that it will just spontaneously become conscious? I want to argue that one doesn't necessitate the other, but I'll just kind of show you the basics of what I'm talking about, and you can contribute your own opinion. Okay, so a lot of the time when we're talking about intelligence versus consciousness, the major kind of areas that it covers are the external versus internal world. So intelligence generally refers to how you respond to external stimuli, and consciousness generally is about how you deal with your internal world. So the kind of traditional theory of human intelligence is the ability to learn, adapt, understand abstract concepts, and to use knowledge to manipulate one's environment. So a lot of this has to do with just kind of responding and reacting to outside stimuli. And if we think about it from this perspective, we could probably say that computers and robots are at this point already. They are able to, take in, adapt to, respond to their environment. So here's just an example, because it's cute and it's currently used in clinical application today. This is the Paro seal, and it's a small little robot that has a bunch of different sensors on it. It has touch sensors, light, audition, temperature, and posture sensors. So it's used in rehabilitation and companionship for elderly patients with neurodegenerative disorders. commonly with dementia patients. So Paro is used to help reduce anxiety and increase socialization. So I found this very interesting from their website. If you stroke it every time you touch it, Paro will remember your previous action and try to repeat that action to be stroked. So we can say it wants to be stroked. If you hit it, Paro remembers its previous actions and tries not to do that action. So this is the kind of learning, the baseline learning and adaptation. Of course, it's not very sophisticated, but this robot is not, the pinnacle of AI technology today. So I'm just giving you an example of how a simple system can fit into our framework of how we define human intelligence. So this is just kind of to clarify that this is the behavioral generation system of Paro. And what I mostly wanted to point out here is that this input of external stimuli here goes into the system of basically proactive processes based on previous experiences, proactive processes based on what it's actually programmed to do, patterns of behavior that it has, and reactive processes based on its previous experiences and its learning. And then it goes through this loop and it outputs certain behavior. So this is pretty similar to what we do as well. So the issue with a lot of these therapeutic robots is that people get very attached to them, as you would predict. And especially when we're using these therapeutic robots in patients that have mental and neurodegenerative disorders, it can be seen as kind of taking advantage of that to form these relationships with obviously things that aren't alive or that aren't conscious. And interesting kind of ethics that are involved in this kind of human robot interaction is that this kind of humanoid morphology and functionality, like the seal being like a fluffy, small animal sized, it's permitted to the extent for the achievement of reasonable design objectives. But this kind of anthropomorphization also causes, creates significant attachment and we could say unidirectional relationships between the two. So it's just something interesting to think about. So I wanted to show you this video because I wanted to talk about how humans can also have different reactions to their external world. So humans can also be fooled. It's not necessarily just robots who are at this level. So this is a really short video, so I'll just explain what they're doing at first. Essentially, this guy here is going to have his left arm here, but it's going to be occluded by this cardboard screen, so he's not going to be able to see it. And both his actual hand and this rubber hand are going to be stimulated the same way, so that his brain is kind of gets tricked into feeling like that rubber hand is attached to his body. So I'll play this really quick. Oh, that's loud. Okay, so the interesting thing here to notice is that he only moved his left hand when he thought it was getting stabbed. So this wasn't just a reflex of him just, moving back. It's because he had kind of, his mind had been tricked into feeling like that rubber hand is somehow attached to his body. So when we're talking about traditional intelligence just being linked to how you respond to the external world, humans aren't necessarily the pinnacle of intelligence. It's easy to fool us, and similarly, it's easy to fool today's robots, and they're not necessarily at that huge different level that we usually think of. So when we talk about consciousness compared to intelligence, consciousness refers more to how we deal with our internal world or the self. So there's different kind of schools of thoughts when it comes to this. The first one is that consciousness is deeply tied to biological mechanisms. So in this school of thought, you can imagine that it would be difficult for robots or computers to kind of replicate this kind of consciousness if it's so deeply rooted in our carbon-based body. The second school of thought is that its consciousness is a byproduct of when specific regions of the brain are stimulated. So that's what this figure here shows. From research that has been done where they isolate areas of the brain that are most active during conscious experiences, they've identified this posterior hot zone, which is most commonly active. So the anterior part and the kind of lower levels of the brain, like the cerebellum, are not necessarily even required, or they're not as active during conscious experiences. And they found that people with anterior lesions or people who are born without a cerebellum, they can have the same kinds of conscious experiences as someone who has a fully intact brain. So in this kind of school of thought, it becomes a bit more achievable for machines or computers to achieve a similar consciousness as humans if it's just, certain connections. Obviously, we don't know what those are yet, but it is more achievable than if consciousness were fully dependent on our physical bodies. So I also wanted to talk about assigning consciousness, because when we think about that Paro seal, or even when we're thinking about our pets, like if you think about your dog or your cat or your bird, if we think about consciousness as being able to have a sense of self and be able to handle these abstract theoretical thoughts, then maybe you would say that, your dog isn't necessarily conscious, if that's the definition we're using. But we still assign consciousness to them. I think most people would be offended if you said your dog is not really conscious. So the thing is, we assign consciousness to not only other living things, but to basically most moving things that we can see. So just to give an example, this is a military robot. Robots are used in the military pretty often, and they have they receive ranks, they receive promotions, they receive medals for their service. When a robot is killed, they have funerals with gun salutes. So we form these kind of bonds. We create these kind of, we essentially create consciousnesses for these different things. So similarly with Opportunity, the rover that died tragically pretty recently, if you read stories about Opportunity, everyone was like, oh, Oppie died, like he did so much good work, he was on Mars for so much longer than he needed to be. We create these kind of personalities for these things. Similarly with therapeutic robots that are used for people who have all kinds of different medical conditions. And even Roombas, if you actually look it up, if you look up anthropomorphization of Roombas, people create personalities for their little Roombas. They're like, oh, they assign these kind of consciousnesses to the things around them. So the question is, do computers or robots even need to achieve a tangible level of consciousness, or are we fine having relationships with them, knowing really that they're not conscious, but being okay with the consciousness that we've assigned them? So there's these constantly moving goalposts for AI. First they have to reach a level of intelligence as, a rat, and then they have to achieve a human level of intelligence, and then they have to gain consciousness. So it's really interesting thinking about what the kind of, when we start classifying things as intelligent and when we start classifying things as conscious. So that's all the slides I had, but I wanted to look at the rest of the chat. I know there were some new things that were added in there. Okay, a similar argument. Would a cloned human not have autonomy? Is it really that big of a step from a Drosophila, rat, monkey to a human? And then I'll read the next one too, and then I'll kind of open the floor. Most countries heavily favor politicians who are older. By the time they're in office, many new developments in terms of technology and the dynamics of social change have progressed far beyond what those politicians worked with and made policies for. You see this lag in policy making alongside it being generally slow to implement. Okay, so does anyone have thoughts on basically anything that we've talked about?
I was just wondering, like, do humans like have like a pre-inclination, just like assign consciousness and like personality to like even inanimate objects? Because like if you look at like folklore and like religion and like mythology, like humans have been doing that for years, even before like these more advanced technologies. So, you know, I'm kind of like wondering like what function does it serve? Like, does it maybe make the known like a bit more approachable for us and like manageable to think about like a robot, like Dr. Solaz's little dog, like as a dog instead of you know, a collection of wires and code and whatnot?
I actually, a lot of the kind of characteristics that we tend to kind of gravitate towards and anthropomorphize are generally like if something is able to move, or if something's similar to an animal, things like that. So even robots that don't necessarily need to look like a living thing, we just create them. We make them look like humans, or we make them look like animals, because we can form these kind of relationships with them. And that's a really interesting question. Like maybe there is some kind of evolutionary purpose, some kind of I don't know, it benefits us in some way, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure why we're so obsessed with kind of assigning personalities to things.
I have a response to Nadia about like how we would decide if a clone human have autonomy. So in one of the ethical classes that I'm taking, we define autonomy and competency by saying that if one person is able to formulate a preference and reason it through like critical thinking and everything, and like express that kind of preference of treatment to you, then we classify it as competency, as being competent, and that person should have autonomy. So I think if a clone human has like sufficient like full functions of being able to think critically and express to you that they have autonomy, then we should treat them as equal as like normal human beings.
Thanks for that response. I guess that goes back to like the like initial question, like whether cloned animals wouldn't have autonomy, because that implies that animals that aren't cloned already have autonomy. So I guess like at the root of this is like we tend to automatically assume that any human, cloned or otherwise, would have autonomy, but where does animal autonomy fit into it, right? So like I wonder if like your ethics class like talks at all about animal autonomy instead of just humans.
We did touch upon it, like we say like we shouldn't torture them or treat them unethically. So that's why I mentioned like if we're gonna use animals, clone or not, as like experimental model, then we should treat them with respect and give them like the best the best life that they could have?
I think it'd be interesting. I'm sorry, everyone. I had to step out for a minute, but I'm back now. But I think, Leanne, your comment. It's interesting to discuss why we think certain beings should have autonomy or rights and why others shouldn't. And like obviously, I think the answer is rational agency, as you mentioned. Like you'd say they have autonomy because they can formulate a preference based on reasoning, because they have a conception of self that persists over time. They're going into that conception to decide like their future, so forth. So they have rational agency, and then we sort of have a two-tier system because then with animals we're fine using them in clinical settings in ways that might be very unethical to humans because well they are sentient but they're not rational. So then they have a lower standard of protection. But I guess it's more interesting than when you compare different types of animals. So you say, oh well, maybe a dolphin or a monkey or a squid has comparatively and a comparatively high intelligence compared to a rat. Does that mean that they should have like greater protections than rats? I'm not sure. But I think that's just something interesting to discuss. And I think there could be some debate as to whether or not rational agency should be the standard for applying a sentient being rights or autonomy.
So once AI can be defined as autonomous, would we have to go through strict ethical regulations before doing experiments on them? Just to follow up, I guess.
There are people that are that think that machines need rights. It's a thing. I saw it online.
Yeah, like I mean it's a very tough discussion. Like how do we decide if the animals actually don't want to be in the experiment? For example, if the animals was like a dolphin, for example, it is very intelligent, high functioning, and rather than like giving it a disease and then dissect it, we just put it on like a psychological test that has very low risk. And we put him in like a very big pool with a lot of stimulation and protect him against like other predators in the nature. Or in other case, if he was born in within the facilities, then he wouldn't know anything outside of it. So how do we decide if he was suffering and if he preferred to be treated differently? Like we basically giving him food and giving him like big swimming pool. Like how do we decide?
One problem that is not a complicating factor with animals, but would be with sentient machines, is figuring out identity. What is this the same animal that we were dealing with before? You can figure that out genetically and just by observation. Whereas you can imagine a sentient machine that would have components, would have modules, right? And so if you divide it in two and then put some of them same modules in a different machine, then does its moral status change, And also the whole idea of lifetime and dying, when you have something that can just be turned off, it's entirely different from the idea of something dying and changing in an irreversible fashion. So there are many questions here beyond the ones you've posed.
I feel like the question of autonomy for AI is also interesting because I mean we would have designed it from the ground up. Everything that we've put into it, we would know, right? It's all the research and all the components that we've created to make this intelligence. I guess for the relation to autonomy, if it were to manufacture those parts on its own or have any sort of decision making in how it would be generated, or create new members of itself, then maybe we can consider that as autonomous.
Well, there are robots making robots right now. There are humanless factories where there just aren't any humans there, and some of those factories without any humans present are making robots. So yeah, that situation already exists today. And the idea that we would have designed every component, you can imagine a situation where robots can make robots, they can make components of themselves, and that there's a considerable black box component in that, you know, there may be parts where humans really can't understand exactly how that's working. So, yeah.
Does anyone else have any thoughts they want to contribute?
I don't know if this is like even a possibility, but when it comes to animal testing and research, I wonder if there is a way for researchers to build relationships with the subject that is being researched on to get some form of consent. Like, obviously we don't speak the same language as we would with dolphins, but like what if there were ways in which we could like build relationships, make a form of communication that works for both, and like empower those subjects being researched to have some form of autonomy that reflects those that we think is like autonomy and like agency. Because like it also reminds me of how like when eugenics was being more actively practiced, how we were doing research and objectifying people who had like mental development or like neurological development disorders. So like those who are like disabled or people like that, we didn't consider them to be able to be agents, therefore didn't deserve like we didn't have any moral duties when engaging with them, that type of thing. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels that can be made with that example to like the animal research and the research that we are doing with AI and technology. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's like my 2 cents of this.
I think that's a really interesting angle because like often in research we're thinking directly about like the human impact, and even when we're thinking about that, there's like difficulty in translating that knowledge to the wider community and actually like making the benefits of that knowledge known, right? So there's like already that gap with just like getting human related research out there to benefit humans. And as you mentioned, there's probably an even bigger gap with getting our research to, you know, benefit animals. Like, okay, we have cures for animal models. I guess I'm wondering if that knowledge is somehow translated to like veterinarians so they can make use of that or something. So at least there's that aspect of it where it's, you know, indirectly benefiting animals.
It also like makes me question, because at the end of the day, it's like very structured settings that we are getting information out of, and the relationships being built are like very in like a defined and constructed ways, that if it would be in regards to animal research especially, like I wonder if it would even apply to wild animals. Like this is something that a lot of like ethical philosophers engage with, and it was like one of the things that I wrote a paper for one of my philosophy classes is like, how do we mitigate the relationships that we have with wild animals who like literally just kind of exist external to the human society, and have their own societies basically, and like forms of governance if we were to really like bring it that far. Like how would we be able to apply the knowledge that we have and ideas that we have when it comes to ethics and moral considerations and like ways of building relations when they're not even like, they obviously, we coexist, but we don't really exist together almost. So like wild animals, like how do we really mitigate with them when it comes to like the research? Because like of the coexistence factor as well, like humans are making all these progress when it comes to disease and like how to treat nature in like provincial parks and how to like take care of water and like what's causing these things, and like we coexist, and so they're obviously getting impacted, but at the same time there's like such a huge disconnect of living together.
Sorry for taking up so much of the conversation, but I wonder if some of these like principles of like, you know, like the ethical things we need to consider in our relationship to animals and like land and stuff, I wonder whether and how they can be applied to AI and technology, right? Because we see technology is so like disparate from us, even though it's definitely a part of our everyday life, more so than nature, I would say nowadays. So like, you know, rethinking our relationship to technology, like, and maybe reflecting some of the current ways that we relate to like, you know, nature and animals in how we relate to technology. But like, you know, as Dr. Saws mentioned, like, you know, technology is different from animals in nature in that it has like an off button that we directly control. But like, I don't know, I think that's something interesting to think about as well.
It will change also as the AI gets better, right? Like right now, we're not in contact with, you know, machines that we really feel are operating at our level. But someday we will, and then they'll be operating at a higher level. And yeah, so, but we're just not there yet. So
I think there's an argument to be made though that regardless of like whether a being, be it animal or technology, is at the same level as us, we need to have like a sort of respect to it. Like I know personally, like, okay, when I see a worm on the sidewalk, like I'm gonna try to like save it, you know, after it like rains and they all come out on the sidewalk, I'm gonna try to like remove it from the puddle so it doesn't drown, or like I'm gonna try not to step on ants. And like I guess it's like, could the same thing be applied to like current technology now? Which I mean, it's hard to think about because it's like Ishita mentioned, like especially for technology that doesn't move, like we don't really prescribe that anthropomorphism there. But I don't know, like I think even with things that aren't at our level, like I think there's an argument to be made for like building a relationship or thinking about how we relate to those lesser beings. And I don't know, that's another argument, whether they're actually like lesser than us or whether we're better than everything else. But yeah.
Yeah, and all those questions are easier than if aliens actually come here, right? And then we're dealing with a whole other kind of structure, right? Of trying to span a difference between something we never knew that there could be this kind of entity, and now deciding how to treat them and how they should treat us. So.
Sorry, one more thing that I will say. I think it's also quite limiting that like the language that we speak and the perspectives that we're coming from are so incredibly biased despite us trying to like unlearn our biases and I think it's really like this has been something that I've been like engaging quite heavily with in my entire like philosophy degree is like, does the language, are we really able to break out of how we perceive and unlearn things and like come to this peak that Aristotle and like Socrates always talks about if we still speak the language that we continue to speak and like if we continue to like survive in the culture and the society, because at the end of the day, like it obviously we are changing and like we are progressing, but the foundations still exist and like things don't really just go away and we can't just at the same time like come up with a new language or like come up with like a new world.
But I'm just to kind of simplify your relationship between these questions and the course, there is that Rich Sutton slide that you're required to know for the exam of what he recommends, that we should treat these beings as equals, be friendly to them, include them in our circle of empathy, and give up the idea that humans have to always be in charge of everything on the earth. So, I mean, it may be overly simplistic, but you're required to know about that for the midterm exam. So, yeah.
Yeah, but it just like still makes me question that this like it's a skeptic perspective, right? Like I'm coming from a skepticist perspective in that like will we actually be able to really respect people coming from our end, like or beings that are non-human, and will we actually fully be able to provide our moral duties and like respects and be ethical in the relationships if we continue to speak the language?
The other side of it is Yuval Noah Harari's assertion that in the future, no one will make important life decisions on their own, that they'll take that question to the sentient machine because it will have been shown that the results are just much better. So what to do with your life, where to live, who to marry, all these things. So that will change the way you feel about sentient machines if you're actually relying on them to give you better answers than any humans could provide. And we presumably will reach that point. So that will automatically, in a sense, increase your respect for this diverse being, very different from you. Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Ishita. It's been a great teaching session, and thank you to the students. And so we'll see you next Tuesday and talk about resilience in the next 100 years. Okay, have a great.
Thanks everyone for participating. It was really nice chatting with you all.